considering that episode 2 marks the beginning of a brand new arc, it makes sense that this episode would be a lot more tame compared to the last. There was a lot of exposition that needed to be done in order to introduce the new setting and characters. I mean, up until now, we've never even heard of this place called Sanctuary. We weren't even made aware that Roswaal had taken half of the villagers there. So there were quite a few gaps that needed to be filled in with this episode. More than anything though, the main focus was the mystery revolving around Roswaal's actions, something that the novel delves into a bit more deeply, which we'll explore in this cut content episode. So, as always, be sure to leave a like or comment if you enjoy this ReZero content. It really goes towards helping the video perform better. Now, let's begin. Episode 27, The Next Place, covering chapters 1 and 2 of volume 10 of the light novel. There were quite a few reasons leading towards Krush and Subaru going their separate ways. We know that Subaru and Amelia had to return to the mansion, but Krush also had a few things to take care of herself, and that was the pressing issue of Anastasia's faction. If Krush wasn't careful with her next actions, then Anastasia could very well steal all the credit for defeating both the White Whale and Sloth. Ideally, the whole endeavor would be treated as a successful joint operation from each of the 3 participating candidates. But it was very clear that Anastasia was the one that came out on top. Her faction still had both their candidate and knight completely intact, a statement that couldn't be said for Krush's or Amelia's side. So very close watch needed to be kept on Anastasia. The only advantage these two had over her was the secrecy of their current alliance. Anyway, after about 3 days, Subaru didn't want to keep the villagers away from their home any longer. You see, during the commotion of the evacuation, many villagers had been separated from their families as half of them were taken to a different area. So it was before they were about to leave that Wilhelm came out to give his regards. That's when the topic of his incurable wound came up yet again. In case you didn't watch episode 1, Wilhelm carries a permanent wound that can't be healed since it was inflicted by a blade that carries the blessing of the Grim Reaper. A wound that was given to him by none other than the previous Sword Saint, his former wife. The thing is, up until the fight with the witches cult, the wound remained in a rather closed state. Only after his encounter with them did it open up as if it was fresh. This was something that was only possible if he was in close proximity to the person who gave him the wound. So it was a very significant mystery involving his supposedly dead wife that Wilhelm was now unsettled by. Perhaps the White Whale may not have been responsible for Tunisia's death at all. Perhaps something a bit more sinister happened. Whatever the answer was, the only person who could possibly give it to him was going to be Gluttony, a foe he was sure to encounter once again if they truly intended to fix both Krush and Rem. Now, during Subaru's conversation with Felix, there was a brief moment where Felix showed his true emotions. It was a side to him that Subaru had never seen before, one that was different from the unconcealable grief that Felix could be seen harboring for the past few days. While Subaru was trying to genuinely thank Felix for all his help, the two began to go back and forth with their usual friendly banter. But it was towards the end that Felix took a more serious tone. He lowered his head, then spoke in a very ominous voice that he was going to protect Krush no matter what. They were words declared in such a way that Subaru didn't even realize that it was Felix who was talking. Though it only lasted for a brief moment, that was really all it took for Subaru to clearly understand Felix's resolve. After this, it wasn't just Krush who gave parting words at the end. Amelia had a few things to say herself which carried a bit of significance. With a strong sense of sincerity, she declared that whatever the results of Subaru's actions may be, she would face them head on. It was proof of her finally accepting Subaru to be by her side. If you were to now call Subaru something akin to her knight, well, that wouldn't be so much of a wrong statement anymore. Amelia then turned directly to Krush and lost what was just her resolute composure. She was much more anxious as she knew that Krush would one day become someone she would have to compete against. Even so, the alliance they'd built was something that she was happy with. So she wanted to make sure that Krush was okay with her being a half-elf. Remember, Amelia isn't used to receiving this type of positive treatment from other people. She's not so confident in herself as a person to believe that others think highly of her. That's why she wanted to make sure that Krush wasn't forcing herself. The desperate look that Amelia had on her face while she asked made Subaru want to intervene. But for some reason he knew that Krush would know exactly what to say. She responded with a line that he'd heard from her once before. A pretentious set of words that only someone like Krush could speak as her own. She said, "The worth of a soul is determined by the worth of a person's actions. We should all live in a way that brings no shame to our souls." Because Amelia then said that she was living her life in a way that she didn't believe to be shameful, Krush felt that there was nothing for her to fear or regret. So long as she continued to walk a path that she could call her own, then Krush was happy to be allied with her. So as Subaru watched these two formally accept each other, he finally felt like he had gained something tangible from all his efforts. Sure, it may not have been the optimal outcome, but it was definitely the best he could get given the circumstances. And he wasn't going to use Rem as an excuse to ruin this moment. That wouldn't be what she wanted. Instead, he accepted Rem and Krush's conditions as direct results of his actions, and he promised that he'd find a way to make things right again. This was such an embarrassing proclamation that Subaru couldn't even fully shake Krush's hand afterwards. Instead, he simply tapped her palm. Moving on to the scene in the carriage, there was a couple additional topics of conversation worth mentioning, one of which was Roswaal. Not only was he someone worth talking to about Rem's condition, but he also had quite a bit of explaining to do. There were two key things that Subaru wanted to know. The first of which was why he chose to back Amelia for the royal selection, and the second was why he didn't come to help when the witch cult attacked. Subaru found it strange that someone with as much power as Roswaal was nowhere to be seen when his own domain was under siege. It was a valid question considering how much he had at stake, but the answer to it was something that could only be found back at the mansion. Until then, Amelia wanted Subaru to tell her more about Rem. At first, the mere suggestion caused Subaru's chest to throb in pain. Not because it wasn't something he wanted to do, but instead because he wasn't sure if he could truly find the right words to say. How could he properly portray the girl who saved him in a way that would do her justice? He eventually figured that the best way would be to just start at the beginning. So Subaru spent the rest of the trip talking about the precious memories he made with Rem for the past 2 months. That's how long it had been since Subaru was summoned to this world. As Subaru spoke of his day-to-day life with Rem, before he could even finish everything he wanted to say, half a day had already passed and they'd now arrived at the village. But the other half of the villagers were nowhere to be found. It was yet another odd situation that was potentially attributed to one of Roswaal's decisions. There was no way that he wasn't yet aware of the village being safe again. Even if Sanctuary was 7 or 8 hours away by horse, Roswaal could easily just fly and do some recon over the area. Not to mention that Ram could have also just used her clairvoyance ability. So the fact that they'd been gone for more than 3 days now was something that just didn't seem right. There had to be a specific reason why Roswaal chose to stay at Sanctuary. Perhaps something had happened to them while they were there. In any case, Subaru figured that if answers were to be found, then the best place to do that would be at the mansion. It was here that we met the new maid Frederica Baumann, a demi-human girl who looked no more than 20 years old, but carried herself as perfectly as a maid could. Now, there was a cut scene between just her and Subaru right before he went to go talk to Beatrice. You see, Subaru wanted to let Rem rest in her own room, so while he was carrying her there, Frederica decided to accompany him so that she could learn more about this sleeping girl. Subaru spoke to her just like how he'd spoken to Amelia while in the carriage, except this time he let many more of his deeper thoughts make its way to the surface, one of which was a crucial realization that there actually could have been a better outcome. Unlike what Subaru had thought before, a subtle clue to Rem's fate had been right in front of him the entire time. He just wasn't able to see it fast enough. If he did, then he might have been able to save Rem before the next checkpoint. What he was referring to was the letter of goodwill that Krush's envoy brought to Amelia. If you remember from Season 1, Subaru's initial assumption with the letter was that the witch's cult swapped it out for a blank one, thus causing Ram to assume that Krush was going to take action against Amelia. But that wasn't the case at all. Subaru only realized after that it wasn't the witch cult's style to resort to sly tactics like sleight of hand. They were more for that direct and upfront violence. So, if that was the case, then where did this blank letter come from? Well, Ram was the one who wrote the letter. By the time that letter would have been received by Ram, her existence would have already been erased from the world. It didn't make the physical letter itself disappear though. Instead, it just erased the contents. That's why the letter was blank. Her words had been erased along with everything else related to her memory. If Subaru had come to this conclusion earlier, then he could have used this information to realize that something went wrong. In the end, he regretted not being smart enough to notice what was now such a glaringly obvious issue, and that only added to his personal feelings of guilt. When the two finally arrived at Rem's room, the place looked completely tidied as if it was no different from a guest room. It was just as clean and empty as the time that Rem had her existence stolen by the white whale. As Subaru rested her in her bed, Frederica offered to be the one to take care of her, but Subaru insisted that it had to be him. Sure, it may have been a selfish request, but it did make Frederica realize that behind Subaru's murderous gaze there was a kind-hearted soul. It's true that his eyes were showing a small glint of hatred, but the comment was made more so with the intent of getting back at Subaru for his outburst with her teeth. That way the two were now equal. In any case, Frederica would eventually have to take care of Rem, but really all she had to do was check up on her from time to time. Considering that Rem wasn't going to hunger or age, not much was needed to be done in terms of care. All Subaru could really ask for was for her to give Rem as much attention as she could offer. It's after this that we gain a bit more context behind who Frederica was before Subaru came to this world. The main reason she was given leave from her previous maid duties was because of Amelia's participation in the royal selection. As someone who had been working for Roswaal for 10 plus years, Frederica's job was to tidy up all of Roswaal's personal affairs before the royal selection was to start. You see, Roswaal knew that Amelia being a candidate was an open invitation to all sorts of trouble. So, because Frederica was one of the senior staff members, he put her in charge of sending off all the other servants. It was after that job was done that she too was also sent away, leaving only Rem and Ram as the last two servants. This was the level of preparation that Roswaal was known for, but now that just didn't seem to be the case. How could he put so much effort into the events preceding the selection yet not do anything now? It made Subaru remember all the times that the witch cult had successfully invaded the mansion and slaughtered everyone. He couldn't help but question why someone as seemingly careful as Roswaal would allow that sort of thing to happen. That's why Subaru felt the need to understand what Roswaal was thinking. It brings us now to the scene with Beatrice. Just like everyone else, she wasn't given any instruction by Roswaal during the recent events. The only judgment she could make was that she was left behind because Roswaal was certain she could protect herself. It's not like Roswaal didn't give it any thought, it's just that not much was needed to be given. Now, even if that was the case, the way that he handled the entire situation still seemed off. So, to try and get a few more answers, Subaru brought out the Gospel. This was the book that formerly belonged to the Archbishop of Sloth, a being that wasn't quite a person but instead an evil spirit that took control of other people's bodies. It was also the first person that Subaru had personally slain. The act of taking a person's life was yet another burden that Subaru had to shoulder. To say that he didn't hesitate in the moment or that he didn't have any regrets would be nothing more than just a lie. The fact that he killed and was killed by Betelgeuse was something that he would forever remember and be affected by. Now, the rest of their conversation pretty much went as we saw. Beatrice paved the path that Subaru needed to follow in order to find his answers and nothing more. When Subaru went back to Amelia, he was shocked to find out that she had already confronted Frederica about the path to Sanctuary. Because this was a place she knew she had to go to, Amelia turned to Subaru to ask a favor. Considering what happened the last time she did this, Subaru didn't even let her finish asking before he started spewing out all the reasons why he should be allowed to go with her to Sanctuary. You see, he thought Amelia was going to ask him to stay behind just like last time, but what she really wanted to ask was for him to go with her. Amelia wanted to be able to rely on Subaru and his strength. She wanted him to be by her side, because without him, she said that she would be too worried to go to Sanctuary on her own. They were sincere words that Subaru couldn't help but find himself speechless by. So, with the two now set on going to Sanctuary, Frederica then asked if Roswaal had told either of them about the type of place it was. Of course, Subaru knew nothing about it, but Amelia remembered being told that it was a place that would someday be necessary for her. An ominous statement that even now she couldn't fully understand. Frederica then went on to tell the two all that she possibly could about Sanctuary. One of the things she mentioned was why she needed 2 days to prepare for their journey. Supposedly the barrier that keeps outside presences away takes 2 days to nullify. At first it was a strange concept to grasp, but the more context Frederica gave, the more sense it made. You see, Sanctuary has long been a place that's deeply rooted with demi-human history. Back when the conflict between demi-humans and humans was at its peak, Sanctuary could be seen as a sort of safe haven for demi-humans, or at least that's the way that Frederica was portraying it. Something about the way that she spoke of the barrier still felt weird though. In any case, what she was saying about the demi-humans seemed to be what made the most sense. I mean, it was quite common to find residents of Lagunica that weren't too fond of demi-humans at all. It was a feeling of scorn that Subaru found to be an extension of the same hate they carried towards half-elves. All this talk of demi-humans then reminded Subaru of a bard he met that goes by the name of LILIANA. While on one of her journeys, she had stopped by the Roswaal mansion to sing a tale of the demi-human civil war, a song that went by the name of the Ballad of the Sword Devil. Up until now, he hadn't even realized that this was a song wholly dedicated to Wilhelm's accomplishments. But now he knew that it could very well have been the reason that Wilhelm gained the Sword Devil nickname in the first place. Anyway, Subaru would then spend the next couple of days trying to search for Beatrice. He didn't want to let things stay the way that they were. But when Beatrice really wants to hide, well, there isn't much that Subaru can do to find her. That's why Subaru put Petra in charge of taking care of Beatrice. As unlikely as it was for them to meet, it did help knowing that someone in the mansion would be there for her if she ever needed it. Perhaps she could actually befriend her since they looked to be the same age. With everything now said and done, all that was left was for Frederica to give Amelia the crystal. Part of the 2 days of preparation was focused towards this item in particular. The odd thing about it was that Frederica never left the mansion to obtain it. It made Subaru wonder where she managed to find such an item without even having to go outside. Wherever it was from, the 2 days weren't just spent on this alone. The crystal was merely something related to it. Now, the last thing that Frederica would say before sending them off was to once again be wary of Garfield. Ever since she had first mentioned his name, Subaru had been struggling to deal with 2 conflicting mindsets. This wasn't the first time that he's heard the name Garfield. Right before the evacuation of the villagers, Ram had spoken of a Garfield as if it was someone that she could trust. But with Frederica now passing on these numerous warnings about him, Subaru wasn't so sure what to think anymore. He wished that Frederica could have told them more, but unfortunately she had made a vow not to. To Subaru, vows and promises were just elegant wordplay. But to almost everyone else in this fantasy world, vows were a holy pledge that should never be violated. Amelia herself personally felt that any kind of pact, covenant, or oath should be upheld with the utmost respect. To her, promises of any kind were very important. They were practically the equivalent of tying 2 people together through a bond of mutual trust. Even if no one was around to hold you accountable to your promises, she felt that it was still right to uphold them since the other party believes that you will do so. When Subaru heard Amelia speak these words with such conviction, he felt the need to apologize for when he broke his own promises with her. So, as he prostrated himself on the floor of the carriage, Amelia explained that it was a mindset that stems from her experience as a spirit mage. It's only natural that she treats something like pacts and promises with such importance, since the very foundation of her relationships with the spirits are built on them. Don't get me wrong though, she wasn't mad at Subaru for treating these things lightly. She simply felt that it was something that he needed to reflect on a little bit more. Anyway, the 2 would eventually reach the Lost Woods where the whole situation with the crystal would occur. Subaru likened the phenomenon he'd experienced to something similar to Beatrice's passage skill. He'd been exposed to passage more than enough times to know what it was like to be teleported. Assuming the crystal didn't have nearly as much power as Beatrice did, he figured that he wasn't too far from where Amelia and Otto were. I mean, the farthest Beatrice had ever been able to teleport him was to the village, so perhaps if he found a clearing somewhere then he could spot where the carriage was. But before he could choose a direction, that's when he spotted the doll-like elf. This was the only way that Subaru could describe her. Everything about her just seemed so emotionless. She didn't even seem to have enough willpower to be considered an actual person. Regardless, she was the only lead that Subaru had. So, after following then losing track of her, Subaru eventually figured that Amelia was the one who was supposed to be teleported. If that was in fact the case, then he decided the best course of action would be to play along with whatever was going on. A decision that would lead him down a path into the ruins and finally to his fateful encounter with Echidna, bringing us to the end of episode 2 and to the end of this cut content. So clearly this episode wasn't as eventful as the last one, but a much larger story is being built here, and hopefully this video allowed you to enjoy it a little bit more. But yeah, that's pretty much it for today. So be sure to leave a like or comment if you enjoyed, and I'll see you next week for episode 3. Ciao!